Peace and power to all the people. Happy Martes. It's a powerful Tuesday. Did y'all catch that lunar eclipse today? Anybody? I was up bright and early. Today my off day, so you know what I mean. We got the off day vibes, got the incense lit, got the book ready. But back to this eclipse, to the lunar eclipse. Did anybody catch it? I'm in Georgia, so it was a little cloudy. I was out there for about good 15, 20 minutes just trying to see if I was going to see some, but no luck, man. So for everybody at work, hope y'all having a great day at work. For everybody at home, hope y'all empowering yourselves, creating those healthy habits. You feel me? We about to discover some more secrets to the universe. So, tap in, get ready, you know what I mean? And let this book play in the background. We on chapter 3, starting from page 87. Blind leaders of the blind. About to go ahead and get my plant medicine in effect. Chew. Let's get this thing cracking.
The mirror of the soul cannot reflect both earth and heaven, and the one vanishes from its surface as the other is glassed upon its deep. Zanoni. We believe that few of those physical phenomena which are genuine are caused by disembodied human spirits. Still, even those that are produced by occult forces of nature, such as happen through a few genuine mediums, and are consciously employed by the so-called jugglers of India and Egypt, deserve a careful and serious investigation by science, especially now that a number of respected authorities have testified.
So in this chapter, we got about an hour, as y'all can see, about an hour and 14 minutes. So for chapter 3, it's only 19 pages. So we're gonna see what we got. Here we go.
That in many cases the hypothesis of fraud does not hold. No doubt there are professed conjurers who can perform cleverer tricks than all the American and English John Kings together. Robert Houdin unquestionably could, but this did not prevent his laughing outright in the face of the academicians when they desired him to assert in the newspapers that he could make a table move or rap answers to questions without contact of hands, unless the table was a prepared one. The fact alone that a now notorious London juggler refused to accept the challenge for £1,000 offered him by Mr. Algernon Joy to produce such manifestations as are usually obtained through mediums, unless he was left unbound and free from the hands of a committee, negatives his expose of the occult phenomena. Clever as he may be, we defy and challenge him to reproduce, under the same conditions, the tricks exhibited even by a common Indian juggler. For instance, the spot to be chosen by the investigators at the moment of the performance, and the juggler to know nothing of the choice. The experiment to be made in broad daylight, without the least preparations for it, without any confederate, but a boy absolutely naked, and the juggler to be in a condition of semi-nudity. After that, we should select out of a variety 3 tricks. The most common among such public jugglers, and that were recently exhibited to some gentlemen belonging to the suite of the Prince of Wales. 1. To transform a rupee, firmly clasped in the hand of a skeptic, into a living cobra, the bite of which would prove fatal, as an examination of its fangs would show. 2. To cause a seed chosen at random by the spectators, and planted in the first semblance of a flower pot, furnished by the same skeptics, to grow, mature, and bear fruit in less than a quarter of an hour. 3. To stretch himself on 3 swords, stuck perpendicularly in the ground at their hilts, the sharp points upward. After that, to have removed first one of the swords, then the other, and after an interval of a few seconds, the last one, the juggler remaining finally lying on nothing, on the air, miraculously suspended at about 1 yard from the ground. When any prestidigitateur, to begin with Houdin and end with the last trickster who has secured gratuitous advertisement by attacking spiritualism, does the same, then, but only then, will we train ourselves to believe that mankind has been evolved out of the hind toe of Mr. Huxley's Eocene Orohippus. We assert again in full confidence that there does not exist a professional wizard, either of the north, south, or west, who can compete with anything approaching success with these untutored, naked sons of the east. These require no Egyptian hall for their performances, nor any preparations or rehearsals, but are ever ready, at a moment's notice, to evoke to their help the hidden powers of nature, which for European prestidigitateurs, as well as for scientists, are a closed book. Verily, as Elihu puts it, great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. To repeat the remark of the English divine Dr. Henry Moore, we may well say, indeed, if there were any modesty left in mankind, the histories of the Bible might abundantly assure men of the existence of angels and spirits. The same eminent man adds, I look upon it as a special piece of providence that fresh examples of apparitions may awaken our benumbed and lethargic minds into an assurance that there are other intelligent beings besides those that are clothed in heavy earth or clay. For this evidence, showing that there are bad spirits, will necessarily open a door to the belief that there are good ones, and lastly, that there is a God. The instance above given carries a moral with it, not only to scientists but to theologians. Men who have made their mark in the pulpit and in professors' chairs are continually showing the lay public that they really know so little of psychology as to take up with any plausible schemer who comes their way, and so make themselves ridiculous in the eyes of the thoughtful student. Public opinion upon this subject has been manufactured by jugglers and self-styled savants, unworthy of respectful consideration. The development of psychological science has been retarded far more by the ridicule of this class of pretenders than by the inherent difficulties of its study. The empty laugh of the scientific nursling or of the fools of fashion has done more to keep man ignorant of his imperial psychical powers than the obscurities, the obstacles, and the dangers that cluster about the subject. This is especially the case with spiritualistic phenomena. That their investigation has been so largely confined to incapables is due to the fact that men of science, who might and would have studied them, have been frightened off by the boasted exposures, the paltry jokes, and the impertinent clamor of those who are not worthy to tie their shoes. There are moral cowards even in university chairs. The inherent vitality of modern spiritualism is proven in its survival of the neglect of the scientific body, and of the obstreperous boasting of its pretended exposures. If we begin with the contemptuous sneers of the patriarchs of science, such as Faraday and Brewster, and end with the professional exposés of the successful mimicker of the phenomena of London, we will not find them furnishing one single well-established argument against the occurrence of spiritual manifestations. My theory is, says this individual in his recent soi-disant exposé, that Mr. Williams dressed up and personified John King and Peter. Nobody can prove that it wasn't so. Thus it appears that, notwithstanding the bold tone of assertion, it is but a theory after all, and spiritualists might well retort upon the exposer, and demand that he should prove that it is so. But the most inveterate, uncompromising enemies of spiritualism are a class very fortunately composed of but few members, who nevertheless claim the louder and assert their views with a clamorousness worthy of a better cause. These were the pretenders to science of young America, a mongrel class of pseudo-philosophers mentioned at the opening of this chapter, with sometimes no better right to be regarded as scholars than the possession of an electrical machine, or the delivery of a puerile lecture on insanity and mediomania. Such men are, if you believe them, profound thinkers and physiologists. There is none of your metaphysical nonsense about them. They are positivists, the mental suckling of Auguste Comte, whose bosoms swell at the thought of plucking deluded humanity from the dark abyss of superstition, and rebuilding the cosmos on improved principles. Irascible psychophobists, no more cutting insult can be offered them than to suggest that they may be endowed with immortal spirits. To hear them, one would fancy that there can be no other souls in men and women than scientific or unscientific souls, whatever that kind of soul may be. Some 30 or 40 years ago in France, Auguste Comte, a pupil of the École Polytechnique, who had remained for years at that establishment as a répétiteur of transcendent analysis and rationalistic mechanics, awoke one fine morning with the very irrational idea of becoming a prophet. In America, prophets can be met with at every street corner. In Europe, they are as rare as black swans. But France is the land of novelties. Auguste Comte became a prophet, and so infectious is fashion sometimes that even in sober England he was considered for a certain time the Newton of the 19th century. The epidemic extended, and for the time being it spread like wildfire over Germany, England, and America. It found adepts in France, but the excitement did not last long with these. The prophet needed money. The disciples were unwilling to furnish it. The fever of admiration for religion without a God cooled off as quickly as it had come on. Of all the enthusiastic apostles of the prophet, there remained one worthy of any attention. It was the famous philologist Litter, a member of the French Institute and a would-be member of the Imperial Academy of Sciences, but whom the Archbishop of Orleans maliciously prevented from becoming one of the immortals. The philosopher-mathematician, the high priest of the religion of the future, taught his doctrine as do all his brother prophets of our modern days. He deified woman and furnished her with an altar, but the goddess had to pay for its use. The rationalists had laughed at the mental aberration of Fourier. They had laughed at the Saint Simonists, and their scorn for spiritualism knew no bounds. The same rationalists and materialists were caught, like so many empty-handed sparrows, by the bird-lime of the new prophet's rhetoric. A longing for some kind of divinity, a craving for the unknown, is a feeling congenital in man. Hence the worst atheists seem not to be exempt from it. Deceived by the outward brilliancy of his ignis fatuus, the disciples followed it until they found themselves floundering in a bottomless morass. Covering themselves with the mask of a pretended erudition, the positivists of this country have organized themselves into clubs and committees with the design of uprooting spiritualism, while pretending to impartially investigate it. Too timid to openly challenge the churches and the Christian doctrine, they endeavor to sap that upon which all religion is based, man's faith in God and his own immortality. Their policy is to ridicule that which affords an unusual basis for such a faith, phenomenal spiritualism. Attacking it at its weakest side, they make for the most of its lack of an inductive method, and for the exaggerations that are to be found in the transcendental doctrines of its propagandists. Taking advantage of its unpopularity and displaying a courage as furious and out of place as that of the errant king of La Mancha, they claim recognition as philanthropists and benefactors who would crush out a monstrous superstition. Let us see in what degree Comte's boasted religion of the future is superior to spiritualism, and how much less likely its advocates are to need the refuge of those lunatic asylums which they officiously recommend for the mediums whom they have been so solicitous about. Before beginning, let us call attention to the fact that 3/4 of the disgraceful features exhibited in modern spiritualism are directly traceable to the materialistic adventurers pretending to be spiritualists.
Wow.
Comte has fulsomely depicted the artificially fecundated woman of the future. She is but elder sister to the Cyprian ideal of the free lovers. The immunity against the future offered by the teachings of his moon-struck disciples has inoculated some pseudo-spiritualists to such an extent as to lead them to form communistic associations. None, however, have proved long-lived, their leading feature being generally a materialistic animalism, gilded over with a thin leaf of Dutch metal philosophy and tricked out with a combination of hard Greek names. The community could not prove anything else than a failure. Plato, in the 5th book of the Republic, suggests a method for improving the human race by the elimination of the unhealthy or deformed individuals, by coupling the better specimens of both sexes. It was not to be expected that the genius of our century, even were he a prophet, would squeeze out of his brain anything entirely new. Comte was a mathematician, cleverly combining several old utopias. He colored the whole and, improving on Plato's idea, materialized it and
Yay!
presented the world with the greatest monstrosity that ever emanated from a human mind. We beg the reader to keep in view that we do not attack Comte as a philosopher, but as a professed reformer. In the irredeemable darkness of his political, philosophical, and religious views, we often meet with isolated observations and remarks in which profound logic and judiciousness of thought rival the brilliancy of their interpretation. But then these dazzle you like flashes of lightning on a gloomy night, to leave you the next moment more in the dark than ever. If condensed and repunctuated, his several works might produce on the whole a volume of very original aphorisms, giving a very clear and really clever definition of most of our social evils. But it would be vain to seek, either through the tedious circumlocution of the 6 volumes of his Cours de Philosophie Positive, or in that parody on priesthood, in the form of a dialogue, the Catechism of the Religion of Positivism, any idea suggestive of even provisional remedies for such evils. His disciples suggest that the sublime doctrines of the prophet were not intended for the vulgar. Comparing the dogmas preached by positivism with their practical exemplifications by its apostles, we must confess the possibility of some very achromatic doctrine being at the bottom of it. While the high priest preaches that a woman must cease to be the female of the man, while the theory of the positivist legislators on marriage and the family chiefly consists in making the woman the mere companion of man by ridding her of every maternal function, and while they are preparing against the future for a substitute for that function by applying to the chaste woman a latent force, some of its lay priests openly preach polygamy, and others affirm that their doctrines are the quintessence of spiritual philosophy. In the opinion of the Romish clergy, whom labor under a chronic nightmare of the devil, Comte offers his woman of the future to the possession of the incubi. In the opinion of more prosaic persons, the divinity of positivism must henceforth be regarded as a biped broadmare. Even Leiter made prudent restrictions while accepting the apostleship of his marvelous religion. This is what he wrote in 1859. M. Comte not only thought that he found the principles, traced the outlines, and furnished the method, but that he had deduced the consequences and constructed the social and religious edifice of the future. It is in this second division that we make our reservations, declaring at the same time that we accept as an inheritance the whole of the first. Further, he says, M. Comte, in a grand work entitled The System of Positive Philosophy, established the basis of a philosophy which must finally supplant every theology in the whole of metaphysics. Such a work necessarily contains a direct application to the government of societies, as it has nothing arbitrary in it, and as we find therein a real science. My adhesion to the principles involved my adhesion to the essential consequences. M. Leiter has shown himself in the light of a true son of his prophet. Indeed, the whole system of Comte appears to have us been built on a play of words. When they say positivism, read nihilism. When you hear the word chastity, know that it means impudicity, and so on. Being a religion based on a theory of negation, its adherents can hardly carry it out practically without saying white when meaning black. Positive philosophy, continues Leiter, does not accept atheism, for the atheist is not a really emancipated mind, but is, in his own way, a theologian still. He gives his explanation about the essence of things. He knows how they began. Atheism is pantheism. This system is quite theological yet, and thus belongs to the ancient party. It really would be losing time to quote any more of these paradoxical dissertations. Comte attained to the apotheosis of absurdity and inconsistency when, after inventing his philosophy, he named it a religion. And as is usually the case, the disciples have surpassed the reformer in absurdity. Supposititious philosophers who shine in the American academies of Comte like a Lampyris noctiluca, besides a planet, leave us in no doubt as to their belief. In contrast that system of thought and life, elaborated by the French apostle with the idiocy of spiritualism, of course to the advantage of the former. To destroy you must replace, exclaims the author of the Catechism of the Religion of Positivism, quoting Cossidier, by the way, without crediting him with the thought. And his disciples proceed to show by what sort of loathsome system they are anxious to replace Christianity, spiritualism, and even science. Positivism perorates one of them, is an integral doctrine. It rejects completely all forms of theological and metaphysical belief, all forms of supernaturalism, and thus spiritualism. The true positive spirit consists in substituting the study of the invariable laws of phenomena for that of their so-called causes, whether proximate or primary. On this ground, it equally rejects atheism, for the atheist is at the bottom a theologian. He adds, plagiarizing sentences from leaders' works. The atheist does not reject the problems of theology, only the solution of these, and so he is illogical. We positivists reject the problem in our turn on the ground that it is utterly inaccessible to the intellect, and we would only waste our strength in a vain search for first and final causes. As you see, positivism gives a complete explanation of the world, of man, his duty and destiny. Very brilliant this, and now by way of contrast we will quote what a real great scientist is. Professor Hare thinks of this system. Comte's positive philosophy, he says, after all, is merely negative. It is admitted by Comte that he knows nothing of the sources and causes of nature's laws, that their origination is so perfectly inscrutable as to make it idle to take up time in any scrutiny for that purpose. Of course, his doctrine makes him avowedly a thorough ignoramus. As to the causes of laws, or the means by which they are established, and can have no basis but the negative argument above stated, in objecting to the facts ascertained in relation to the spiritual creation. Thus, while allowing the atheist his material dominion, spiritualism will erect within and above the same space a dominion of an importance as much greater as eternity is to the average duration of human life, and as the boundless regions of the fixed stars are to the habitable area of this globe. In short, positivism proposes to itself to destroy theology, metaphysics, spiritualism, atheism, materialism, pantheism, and science, and it must finally end in destroying itself. De Merville thinks that according to positivism, order will begin to reign in the human mind only on the day when psychology will become a sort of cerebral physics, and history a kind of social physics. The modern Mohammed first disturbs man and woman of God in their own soul, and then unwittingly disembowels his own doctrine with the too sharp sword of metaphysics, which all the time he thought he was avoiding, thus letting out every vestige of philosophy. In 1864, M. Paul Janet, a member of the Institute, pronounced a discourse upon positivism, in which occurred the following remarkable words. There are some minds which were brought up and fed on exact and positive sciences, but which feel nevertheless a sort of instinctive impulse for philosophy. They can satisfy this instinct, but with elements that they had already on hand. Ignorant in psychological sciences, having studied only the rudiments of metaphysics, they nevertheless are determined to fight these same metaphysics as well as psychology, of which they know as little as of the other. After this is done, they will imagine themselves to have founded a positive science, while the truth is that they have only built up a new mutilated and incomplete metaphysical theory. They arrogate to themselves the authority and infallibility properly belonging alone to the true sciences, those which are based on experience and calculations, but they lack such an authority, for their ideas, defective as they may be, nevertheless belong to the same class as those which they attack. Hence the weakness of their situation, the final ruin of their ideas, which are soon scattered to the four winds. The positivists of America have joined hands in their untiring efforts to overthrow spiritualism. To show their impartiality, though, They propound such novel queries as follows: how much rationality is there in the dogmas of the Immaculate Conception, the Trinity, and the transubstantiation if submitted to the tests of physiology, mathematics, and chemistry? And they undertake to say that the vagaries of spiritualism do not surpass in absurdity these eminently respectable beliefs. Very well, but there is neither theological absurdity nor spiritualistic delusion that can match in depravity and imbecility that positivist notion of artificial fecundation. Denying to themselves all thought on primal and final causes, they apply their insane theories to the construction of an impossible woman for the worship of future generations. The living, immortal companion of man they would replace with the Indian female fetish of the Obeah, a wooden idol that is stuffed every day with serpents' eggs to be hatched by the heat of the sun. And now, if we are permitted to ask in the name of common sense, why should Christian mystics be taxed with credulity, or the spiritualists be consigned to bedlam, when a religion embodying such revolting absurdity finds disciples even among academicians? And such insane rhapsodies as the following can be uttered by the mouth of Comte and admired by his followers. My eyes are dazzled. They open each day for more and more to the increasing coincidence between the social advent of the feminine mystery and the mental decadence of the Eucharistical sacrament. Already the Virgin has dethroned God in the minds of Southern Catholics. Positivism realizes the utopia of the medieval ages by representing all the members of the great family as the issue of a virgin mother without a husband. And again, after giving the modus operandi, the development of the new process would soon cause to spring up a caste without heredity, better adapted to the vulgar procreation, to the recruitment of spiritual chiefs, or even temporal ones, whose authority should then rest upon an origin truly superior, which would not shrink from an investigation. To this we might inquire with propriety, whether there has ever been found in the vagaries of spiritualism, or the mysteries of Christianity, anything more preposterous than this ideal, coming race. If the tendency of materialism is not grossly belied by the behavior of some of its advocates, those who publicly preach polygamy, we fancy that whether or not there will ever be a sacerdotal strip so begotten, we shall see no end of progeny, the offsprings of mothers without husbands. How natural that a philosophy which could engender such a caste of didactic incubi should express through the pen of one of its most garrulous essayists the following sentiments. This is a very sad age, full of dead and dying faiths, full of idle prayers sent out in vain search for the departing gods. But oh, it is a glorious age, full of that golden light which streams from the ascending sun of science. What shall we do for those who are shipwrecked in faith, bankrupt in intellect, but who seek comfort in the mirage of spiritualism, the delusions of the transcendentalism, or the will o' the wisp of mesmerism? The ignis fatuus, now so favorite an image with many dwarf philosophers, had itself to struggle for recognition. It is not so long since the now familiar phenomena was stoutly denied by a correspondent of the London Times, whose assertions carried weight, till the work of Dr. Phipson, supported by the testimony of Beccaria, Humboldt, and other naturalists, set the question at rest. The positivists should choose some happier expression, and follow the discoveries of science at the same time. As to mesmerism, it has been adopted in many parts of Germany, and is publicly used with undeniable success in more than one hospital. Its occult properties have been proved and are believed in by physicians, whose eminence, learning, and merited fame the self-complacent lecturer on mediums and insanity cannot well hope to equal. We have to add but a few more words before we drop this unpleasant subject. We have found positivists particularly happy in the delusion that the greatest scientists of Europe were Comtists. How far their claims may be just, as regards other savants, we do not know. But Huxley, whom all Europe considers one of her greatest scientists, most decidedly declines that honor, and Dr. Maudsley of London follows suit. In a lecture delivered by the former gentleman of 1868 in Edinburgh, The Physical Basis of Life, he appears to be very much shocked at the liberty taken by the Archbishop of York in identifying him with Comte's philosophy. So far as I'm concerned, Mr. Huxley says, the most reverend prelate might dialectically hew Mr. Comte in pieces, as a modern Agag, and I would not attempt to stay his hand. And so far as my study of what specially characterizes the positive philosophy has led me, I find therein little or nothing of scientific value, and a great deal which is as thoroughly antagonistic to the very essence of science as anything in ultramontane Catholicism. In fact, Comte's philosophy and practice might be compendiously described as Catholicism minus Christianity. Further, Huxley even becomes wrathful and falls to accusing Scotchmen of ingratitude for having allowed the bishop to mistake Comte for the founder of a philosophy which belonged by right to Hume. It was enough, exclaims the professor, to make David Hume turn in his grave, that here, almost within earshot of his house, an interested audience should have listened without a murmur, while his most characteristic doctrines were attributed to a French writer of 50 years later date, in whose dreary and verbose pages we miss alike the vigor and thought and clearness of style. Poor Comte! It appears that the highest representatives of his philosophy are now reduced, at least in this country, to one physicist, one physician who has made a specialty of nervous diseases, and one lawyer, a very witty critic nicknamed the Desperate Trio, an animalistic triad, which amid its arduous labors finds no time to acquaint itself with the principles and laws of their language. To close this question, the positivists neglect no means to overthrow spiritualism in favor of their religion. Their high priests are made to blow their trumpets untiringly. And though the walls of no modern Jericho are ever likely to tumble down in dust before their blast, still they neglect no means to attain the desired object. Their paradoxes are unique, and their accusations against spiritualists irresistible in logic. In a recent lecture, for instance, it was remarked that the exclusive exercise of religious instinct is productive of sexual immorality. Priests, monks, nuns, saints, media, ecstatics, and devotees are famous for their impurities. We are happy to remark that while positivism loudly proclaims itself a religion, spiritualism has never pretended to be anything more than a science, a growing philosophy, or rather a research in hidden and yet unexplained forces in nature. The objectiveness of its various phenomena has been demonstrated by more than one genuine representative of science, and as ineffectually denied by her monkeys. Finally, it may be remarked of our positivists who deal so unceremoniously with every psychological phenomena that they are like Samuel Butler's rhetorician, who could not ope his mouth, but out there flew a trope. We could there were no occasion to extend the critic's glance beyond the circle of triflers and pedants who improperly wear the title of men of science. But it is also undeniable that the treatment of new subjects by those who rank is high in the scientific world but too often passes unchallenged, when it is amenable to censor. That cautiousness bred of a fixed habit of experimental research, the tentative advance from opinion to opinion, the weight accorded to recognized authorities, all foster a conservatism of thought which naturally runs into dogmatism. The price of scientific progress is too commonly the martyrdom or ostracism of the innovator. The reformer of the laboratory must, so to speak, carry the citadel of custom and prejudice to the point of the bayonet. It is rare that even a postern door is left ajar by a friendly hand. The noisy protests and impertinent criticisms of the little people of the antechamber of science he can afford to let pass unnoticed. The hostility of the other class is a real peril that the innovator must face and overcome. Knowledge does increase apace, but the great body of scientists are not entitled to the credit. In every instance they have done their best to shipwreck the new discovery, together with the discoverer. The palm is to him he who has won it by individual courage. inquisitiveness, and persistency. Few are the forces in nature which, when first announced, were not laughed at, and then set aside as absurd and unscientific, humbling the pride of those who had not discovered anything, the just claims of those who had been denied a hearing until negation was no longer prudent. And then, alas for poor selfish humanity, these very discoverers too often became the opponents and oppressors in their turn, of still more recent explorers in the domain of natural law. So, step by step, mankind moved around their circumscribed circle of knowledge, science constantly correcting its mistakes, and readjusting on the following day the erroneous theories of the preceding one. This has not been the case, not merely with questions pertaining to psychology, such as mesmerism in its dual sense of a physical and spiritual phenomena, but even with such discoveries as directly related to exact sciences, and have been easily to demonstrate. What can we do? Shall we recall the disagreeable past? Shall we point to medieval scholars combining with the clergy to deny the heliocentric theory, for fear of hurting an ecclesiastical dogma? Must we recall how learned conchologists once denied that the fossil shells found scattered all over the face of the earth were ever inhabited by living animals at all? How the naturalists of the 18th century declared these but mere facsimiles of animals? And how these naturalists fought and quarreled and battled and called each other names over these venerable mummies of the ancient ages for nearly a century, until Buffon settled the question by proving to the negators that they were mistaken. Surely an oyster shell is anything but transcendental and ought to be quite a palpable subject for any exact study. And if the scientists could not agree on that, we can hardly expect them to believe at all the evanescent forms of hands, faces, and whole bodies sometimes appear at the seances of spiritual mediums when the latter are honest. There exists a certain work which might afford very profitable reading for the leisure hours of a skeptical man of science. It is a book published by Flourens, the perpetual secretary of the French Academy, called Histoire des Recherches de Buffon. The author shows in it how the great naturalists combated and finally conquered the advocates of the facsimile theory, and how they still went on denying everything under the sun, until at times the learned body fell into a fury, an epidemic of negation. It denied Franklin and his refined electricity, laughed at Fulton and his concentrated steam, voted the engineer Prudhomme a straitjacket for his offer to build railroads, stared Harvey out of countenance, and proclaimed Bernard de Palissy as stupid as one of his own pots. In his oft-quoted work, Conflict Between Religion and Science, Professor Draper shows a decided propensity to kick the beam of the scales of justice, and lay all such impediments to the progress of science at the door of the clergy alone. With all respect and admiration due to this eloquent writer and scientist, we must protest and give every one his just due. Many of the above enumerated discoveries are mentioned by the author of the conflict. In every case he denounces the bitter resistance on the part of the clergy, and keeps silent on the like opposition invariably experienced on every new discovery at the hands of science. His claim on behalf of science that knowledge is power is undoubtedly just. But abuse of power, whether it proceeds from excess of wisdom or ignorance, is alike obnoxious in its effects. Besides, the clergy are silenced now. Their protests would at this day be scarcely noticed in the world of science. But while theology is kept in the background, the scientists have seized the scepter of despotism with both hands, and they use it, like the cherubim and flaming sword of Eden, to keep the people away from the tree of immortal life and within this world of perishable matter. The editor of the London Spiritualist, in answer to Dr. Gully's criticism of Mr. Tyndall's fire mist theory, remarks that if the entire body of spiritualists are not roasting alive at Smithfield in the present century, it is to science alone that we are indebted for this crowning mercy. Well, let us admit that the scientists are indirectly public benefactors in this case, to the extent that the burning of erudite scholars is no longer fashionable. But it is unfair to ask whether the disposition manifested toward the spiritualistic doctrine by Faraday, Tyndall, Huxley, Agassiz, and others does not warrant the suspicion that if these learned gentlemen and their following had their unlimited power once held by the Inquisition, spiritualists would not have reason to feel as easy as they do now. Even supposing that they should not roast believers in the existence of a spirit world, it being unlawful to cremate people alive, would they not send every spiritualist they could to Bedlam? Did they not call us incurable monomaniacs, hallucinated fools, fetish worshippers, and like characteristic names? Really, we cannot see what should have stimulated to such extent the gratitude of the editor of the London Spiritualist for the benevolent tutelage of the men of science. We believe that the recent Lancaster Dunklin Slade prosecution in London ought to last to open the eyes of hopeful spiritualists, and show them that the stubborn materialism is often more stupidly bigoted than religious fanaticism itself. One of the cleverest productions of Professor Tyndall's pen is his caustic essay upon Martineau and materialism. At the same time, it is one which in future years the author will doubtless be only too ready to trim to certain unpardonable grossness of expression. For the moment, however, we will not deal with these, but consider what he has to say on the phenomena of consciousness. He quotes this question from Mr. Martineau. A man can say, I feel, I think, I love, but how does his consciousness infuse itself into the problem? And thus answers, the passage from the physics of the brain to the corresponding facts of consciousness is unthinkable. Granted that a definite thought and a molecular action in the brain occurs simultaneously. We do not possess the intellectual organ, nor apparently any rudiments of the organ, which would enable us to pass by a process of reasoning from one to the other. They appear together, but we do not know why. Were our minds and senses so expanded, strengthened, and illuminated as to enable us to see and feel the very molecules of the brain? Or are we capable of following all their motions and their groupings, all their electric discharges, if such there be? And were we intimately acquainted with the corresponding states of thought and feeling? We should be as far as ever from the solution of the problem. How are these physical processes connected with the facts of consciousness? The chasm between the two classes of phenomena would still remain intellectually impassable. This chasm as impassable to Professor Tyndall as the fire mist where the scientist is confronted with its unknowable cause, as a barrier only to men without spiritual intuitions. Professor Buchanan's Outlines of Lectures on the Neurological System of Anthropology, a work written so far back as 1854, contains suggestions that, if the soilists would only heed them, would show how a bridge can be thrown across this dreadful abyss. It is one of the bins in which the thought seed of future harvests is stored up by a frugal present. But the edifice of materialism is based entirely upon that gross substructure, the reason. When they have stretched its capabilities to their utmost limits, its teachers can best only disclose to us a universe of molecules animated by an occult impulse. What better diagnosis of the ailment of our scientists could be asked than can be derived from Professor Tyndall's analysis of the mental state of the ultramontane clergy by a very slight change of names? For spiritual guides, read scientists. For pre-scientific past, substitute materialistic present. Say spirit for science. And in the following paragraph, we have a life portrait of the modern man of science drawn by the hand of a master. The spiritual guides live so exclusively in the pre-scientific past that even the really strong intellects among them are reduced to atrophy as regards scientific truth. Eyes have seen and seen not. Ears they have and hear not, for both eyes and ears are taken possession of the sights and sounds of another age. In relation to science, the ultramontane brain, through lack of exercise, is virtually the undeveloped brain of a child. And thus it is that as children in scientific knowledge, but as potent wielders of spiritual power among the ignorant, they countenance and enforce practices sufficient to bring the blush of shame to the cheeks of the more intelligent among themselves. The occultist holds this mirror up to science that it may see how it looks itself. Since history recorded the first laws established by man, there never yet was a people whose code did not hang in the issue of the life and death of its citizens upon the testimony of 2 or 3 credible witnesses. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. Says Moses, the first legislator we meet in ancient history. The laws which put to death a man on the deposition of 1 witness are fatal to freedom, says Montesquieu. Reason claims there should be 2 witnesses. Thus, the value of evidence has been tacitly agreed upon and accepted in every country. But the scientists will not accept the evidence of the million against 1. In vain do hundreds of thousands of men testify to facts. Oculos habent et non vident. They are determined to remain blind and deaf. 30 years of practical demonstrations, and the testimony of some millions of believers in America and Europe are certainly entitled to some degree of respect and attention. Especially so when the verdict of 12 spiritualists, influenced by the evidence testified by any 2 others, is competent to send even a scientist to swing on the gallows for a crime, perhaps committed under the impulse supplied by a commotion among the cerebral molecules unrestrained by a consciousness of future moral retribution. Towards science as a whole, as a divine goal, the whole civilized world ought to look with respect and veneration. For science alone can enable man to understand the deity by the true appreciation of his works. Science is the understanding of truth or fact, says Webster. It is an investigation of truth for its own sake and a pursuit of pure knowledge. If the definition be correct, then the majority of our modern scholars have proved false to their godness. Truth for its own sake. And where should the keys of every truth in nature be searched for, unless in the hitherto unexplored mystery of psychology? Alas, that in questioning nature so many men of science should daintily sort over the facts and choose only for the study as best bolster their prejudices. Psychology has no worse enemies than the medical school, denominated allopathists. It is in vain to remind them that of the so-called exact sciences, medicine confessedly least deserves the name. Although all the branches of medical knowledge, psychology ought more than any other be studied by physicians, since without its help their practice degenerates into mere guesswork and chance intuitions. They almost wholly neglect it. The least dissent from their promulgated doctrines is resented as a heresy. And though an unpopular and unrecognized curative method should be shown to save thousands, they seem as a body disposed to cling to accepted hypotheses and prescriptions, and to create both innovator and innovation until they get the mint stamp of regularity. Thousands of unlucky patients may die meanwhile, but so long as professional honor is vindicated, this is a matter of secondary importance. Theoretically, the most benign and at the same time, no other school of science exhibits so many instances of petty prejudice, materialism, atheism, and malicious stubbornness as medicine. The predilections and patronage of the leading physicians are scarcely overmeasured by the usefulness of a discovery. Bleeding by leeching, cupping, and the lancet had its epidemic of popularity, but at last fell into merited disgrace. Water, now freely given to fevered patients, was once denied them. Warm baths were superseded by cold water, and for a while hydropathy was a mania. Peruvian bark, which a modern defender of biblical authority seriously endeavors to identify with the paradisiacal tree of life, and which was brought to Spain in 1632, was neglected for years. The Church, for once, showed more discrimination than science. At the request of Cardinal de Lugo, Innocent X gave it the prestige of its powerful name. In an old book entitled Demonologia, the author cites many instances of important remedies which, being neglected at first, afterward rose into notice through mere accident. He also shows that the most of the new discoveries in medicine have turned out to be more than the revival and readoption of very ancient practices. During the last century, the root of the male fern was sold and widely advertised as a secret nostrum by a Madame Nofleur, a female quack for the effective cure of the tapeworm. The secret was bought by Louis XV for a large sum of money, after which the physicians discovered that it was recommended and administered in that disease by Galen. The famous powder of the Duke of Portland for the gout was the diacentorion of Celius Aurelianus. Later, it was ascertained that it had been used by the earliest medical writers, who had found in it the writings of the old Greek philosophers. So with the O medicinale of Dr. Husson, whose name it bears. The famous remedy for the gout was recognized under its new mask to be the colchicum autumnale, or meadow saffron, which is identical with a plant called Hermodactylus, whose merit as a certain antidote to gout were recognized and defended by Oribasius, a great physician of the 4th century, and Itius Amadenus, another eminent physician of Alexandria, 5th century. Subsequently, it was abandoned and fell into disfavor only because it was too old to be considered good by the members of the medical faculties that flourished toward the end of the last century. Even the great Magendie, the wise physiologist, was not above discovering that which had already been discovered and found good by the oldest physicians. His proposed remedy against consumption, namely the use of prussic acid, may be found in the works of Linnaeus. Eminentates Academici, Volume 4, in which he shows distilled laurel water to have been used with great profit in pulmonary consumption. Pliny also assures us that the extract of almonds and cherry pits has cured the most obstinate coughs. As the author of Demonologia well remarks, it may be asserted with perfect safety that all the various secret preparations of opium, which have been lauded as the discovery of modern times, may be recognized in the works of ancient authors, who see themselves so discredited in our days. It is admitted on all hands that from time immemorial the distant East was the land of knowledge. Not even in Egypt were botany and mineralogy so extensively studied as by the savants of archaic Middle Asia. Sprengel, unjust and prejudiced as he shows himself in everything else, confesses this much in his Histoire de la Médecine. And yet, notwithstanding this, whenever the subject of magic is discussed, that of India has rarely suggested itself to anyone. For of its general practice in that country less is known than among any other ancient people. With the Hindus it was and is more esoteric, if possible, than it was even among the Egyptian priests. So sacred was it deemed that its existence was only half admitted, and it was only practiced in public emergencies. It was more than a religious matter, for it was considered divine. The Egyptian hierophants, notwithstanding the practice of a stern and pure morality, could not be compared for one moment with the ascetical gymnosophists, either in holiness of life or miraculous powers developed in them by the supernatural abjuration of everything earthly. By those who knew them well, they were held in still greater reverence than the Magians of Chaldea. Denying themselves the simple comforts of life, they dwelt in woods and led the life of the most secluded hermits, while their Egyptian brothers at least congregated together, notwithstanding the slur thrown by history on all who practiced magic and divination. It has proclaimed them as possessing the greatest secret to medical knowledge and unsurpassed skills in the practice. Numerous are the volumes preserved in Hindu convents, in which are recorded the proofs of their learning. To attempt to say whether these gymnosophists were the real founders of magic in India, or whether they only practiced what had been passed to them as an inheritance from the earliest rishis, the 7 primeval sages, would be regarded as a mere speculation by exact scholars. The care which they took in educating youth, in familiarizing it with generous and virtuous sentiments, did them peculiar honor, and their maxims and discourses, as recorded by historians, prove that they were experts in matters of philosophy, metaphysics, astronomy, morality, and religion. Says a modern writer, they preserved their dignity under the sway of the most powerful princes, whom they would not condescend to visit, or to trouble for the slightest favor. If the latter desired the advice or the prayers of the holy men, they were either obliged to go themselves or to send messengers. To these men no secret power of either plant or mineral was unknown. They had fathomed nature to its depths, while psychology and physiology were to them open books, and the result was that science, or machagogia, that is now termed so superciliously magic. While the miracles recorded in the Bible had become accepted facts, with the Christians, to disbelieve which is regarded as infidelity. The narratives of wonders and prodigies found in the Atharva Veda either provoke their contempt or are viewed as evidences of diabolism. And yet, in more than one respect, notwithstanding the unwillingness of certain Sanskrit scholars, we can show the identity between the two. Moreover, as the Vedas have now been proved by scholars to antedate the Jewish Bible by many ages, the inference is an easy one that if one of them has borrowed one from the other, the Hindu sacred books are not to be charged with plagiarism. First of all, their cosmogony shows how erroneous has been the opinion prevalent among civilized nations that Brahma was ever considered by the Hindus their chief or supreme god. Brahma is a secondary deity, and like Jehovah, is a mover of the waters. He is the creating god, and has in his allegorical representations 4 heads, answering to the 4 cardinal points. He is the demiurgos, the architect of the world. In the primordiate state of the creation, says Polyer's Mythology des Indus, the rudimental universe, submerged in water, reposed in the bosom of the eternal. Sprang from this chaos and darkness, Brahma, the architect of the world, poised on a lotus leaf, floated, moved upon the waters, unable to discern anything but water and darkness. This is as identical as possible with the Egyptian cosmogony, which shows in its opening sentences Athor, or Mother Night, which represents illimitable darkness, as the primeval element which covered the infinite abyss, animated by water and the universal spirit of the eternal, dwelling alone in chaos. As in the Jewish scriptures, the history of the creation opens with the Spirit of God and his creative emanation, another deity. Perceiving such a dismal state of things, Brahma soliloquizes in consternation. Who am I? Whence I came? Then he hears a voice. Direct your prayer to Bhagavant, the Eternal, known also as Parabrahman. Brahma, rising from this natatory position, seats himself upon the lotus in an attitude of contemplation, and reflects upon the Eternal, who, pleased with this evidence of piety, disperses the primeval darkness and opens his understanding. After this, Brahma issues from the universal egg, infinite chaos, as light, for his understanding is now opened, and he sets himself to work. He moves on the eternal waters. With the Spirit of God within himself, in his capacity of mover of the water, he is Narayana. The lotus, the sacred flower of the Egyptians, as well as the Hindus, is the symbol of Horus as it is that of Brahma. No temples in Tibet or Nepal are found without it, and the meaning of the symbol is extremely suggestive. A sprig of lilies placed in the hand of the archangel, who offers them to the Virgin Mary in the pictures of the Annunciation, have in their esoteric symbolism precisely the same meaning. We refer to the reader to Sir William Jones. With the Hindus, the lotus is the emblem of the productive power of nature. Through the agency of fire and water, spirit and matter, eternal, says a verse in the Bhagavad Gita. I see Brahma, the creator, enthroned in thee above the lotus. And Sir W. Jones shows that the seeds of the lotus contain, even before they germinate, perfectly formed leaves, the miniature shapes of what one day, as perfected plants, they will become. Or as the author of the heathen religion has it, nature thus giving us a specimen of the preformation of its productions, adding further that the seed of all phenogamous plants bearing proper flowers contain an embryo plantlet ready formed. With the Buddhists, it has the same signification. Mahamaya, or Mahadeva, the mother of Gautama Buddha, had the birth of her son announced to her by Bodhisattva, the spirit of Buddha, who appeared beside her couch with a lotus in his hand. Thus also Osiris and Horus are represented by the Egyptians constantly in association with the lotus flower. These facts all go to show the identical parentage of this idea in the 3 religious systems, Hindu, Egyptian, and Judeo-Christian. Wherever the mystic water lily, lotus, is employed, it signifies the emanation of the objective from the concealed, or subjective, the eternal thought of the ever-invisible deity passing from the abstract into the concrete or visible form. For as soon as darkness was dispersed and there was light, Brahma's understanding was opened. And he saw in the ideal world, which had hitherto lain eternally concealed in the divine thought, the archetypal forms of all the infinite future things that would be called into existence, and hence become visible. At this stage of action, Brahma had not yet become the architect, the builder of the universe. For he had, like the architect, to first acquaint himself with the plan, and realize the ideal forms which were buried in the bosom of the Eternal One, as the future lotus leaves are concealed within the seed of that plant. And it is in this idea that we must look for the origin and explanation of the verse in the Jewish cosmogony which reads, "And God said, Let the earth bring forth the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself." In all the primitive religions, the Son of the Father is the creative God, i.e., his thought made visible. And before the Christian era, from the Trimurti of the Hindus down to the three Kabbalistic heads of the Jewish explained scriptures, the triune Godhead of each nation was fully defined and substantiated in all its allegories. In the Christian creed, we see but the artificial engrafting of a new branch upon the old trunk, and the adoption by the Greek and Roman churches of the lily symbol held by the archangel at the moment of the Annunciation shows a thought of precisely the same metaphysical significance. The lotus is the product of fire, heat, and water, hence the dual symbol of spirit and matter. The god Brahma is the second person of the Trinity, as are Jehovah, Adam Kadmon, and Osiris, or rather Pymander, or the power of the thought divine, of Hermes. For it is Pymander who represents the root of all the Egyptian sun gods. The eternal is the spirit of fire, which stirs up and fructifies and develops into a concrete form everything that is born of water or the primordial earth, evolved out of Brahma. But the universe is itself Brahma, and he is the universe. This is the philosophy of Spinoza, which he derived from that of Pythagoras, and it is the same for which Bruno died a martyr. How much Christian theology has gone astray from its point of departure is demonstrated in this historical fact. Bruno was slaughtered for the exegesis of a symbol that was adopted by the earliest Christians and expounded by the apostles. The sprig of water lilies on Bodhisat and later of Gabriel, typifying water and fire, or the idea of creation and generation, is worked into the earliest dogma of the baptismal sacrament. Bruno's and Spinoza's doctrines are nearly identical, though the words of the latter are more veiled and far more cautiously chosen than those to be found in the theories of the author of the Causa Principio et Uno, or the Infinito Universo Immundi. Both Bruno, who confessed that the source of his information was Pythagoras, and Spinoza, who, without acknowledging it as frankly, allows his philosophy to betray the secret, view the first cause from the same standpoint. With them, God is an entity totally per se, an infinite spirit, and the only being utterly free and independent of either effects or other causes, who through that same will which produced all things and gave the first impulse to every cosmic law, perpetually keeps in existence and order everything in the universe. As well as the Hindu Svavikas, erroneously called atheists, who assume that all things, men as well as gods and spirits, were born from Svabhava, or their own nature. Both Spinoza and Bruno were led to the conclusion that God is to be sought for within nature and not without. For creation being proportional to the power of the Creator, the universe as well as its Creator must be infinite and eternal, one form emanating from its own essence and creating in its turn another. The modern commentators affirm that Bruno, unsustained by the hope of another and better world, still surrendered his life rather than his convictions, thereby allowing it to be inferred that Giordano Bruno had no belief in the continued existence of man after death. Professor Draper asserts most positively that Bruno did not believe in the immortality of the soul. Speaking of the countless victims of the religious intolerance of the Popish Church, he remarks, "The passage from this life to the next, though through a hard trial, was the passage from a transient trouble to an eternal happiness. On his way through the dark valley, the martyr believed that there was an invisible hand that would lead him. For Bruno there was no such support. Philosophical opinions for the sake of which he surrendered his life could give him no consolation. But Professor Draper seems to have a very superficial knowledge of the true belief of the philosophers. We can leave Spinoza out of the question and even allow him to remain in the eyes of his critics an utter atheist and materialist. For the cautious reserve which he placed upon himself in his writings make it extremely difficult for one who does not read him between the lines and is not thoroughly acquainted with the hidden meaning of the Pythagorean metaphysics to ascertain what his real sentiments were. But as for Giordano Bruno, if he adhered to the doctrines of Pythagoras, he might have believed in another life. Hence, he could not have been an atheist whose philosophy offered him no such consolation. His accusation and subsequent confession, as given by Professor Domenico Berti in his Life of Bruno, and compiled from original documents recently published, proved beyond doubt that there were his real philosophy, creed, and doctrines. In common with the Alexandrian Platonists and the later Kabbalists, he held that Jesus was a magician in the sense given to this appellation by Porphyry and Cicero, who call it the divina sapientia, divine knowledge, and by Philo-Judaeus, who described the Magi as the most wonderful inquirers into the hidden mysteries of nature, not in the degrading sense given to the word magic in our century. In his noble conception, the Magi were holy men, who, setting themselves apart from everything else on this earth, contemplated the divine virtues and understood the divine nature of the gods and spirits the more clearly, and so initiated others into the same mysteries, which consist of one holding an uninterrupted intercourse with these invisible beings during life. But we will show Bruno's inmost philosophical convictions better by quoting fragments from the accusation and his own confession. The charges in the denunciation of Mocenigo, his accuser, are expressed in the following terms. I, Zuane Mocenigo, son of the most illustrious Sir Marcantonio, denounce to your very reverend fathership, by constraint of my conscience and by order of my confessor, that I have heard say by Giordano Bruno several times when he discoursed with me in my house, that it is a great blasphemy in Catholics to say that the bread transubstantiates itself into flesh, that he is opposed to the Mass, that no religion pleases him, that Christ was a wretch, untristo, and that if he did wicked works to seduce the people, he might well predict that he ought to be impaled, that there is no distinction of persons in God, and that it would be imperfection in God, that the world is eternal, and that there are infinite worlds, and that God makes them continually because he says he desires all he can, that Christ did apparent miracles and was a magician, and so were the apostles.
We got 8 minutes left. Yeah, so, you know what I mean? So, as y'all see what I put on the board, Jesus was a magician, inferring that that being knew and was capable of performing acts in accordance with natural science, hence why they killed him. Also, Magi were holy men, truth seekers, also magicians. You know what I'm saying? Like back then they didn't call it miracles, cause oh no, y'all gotta feel me for this. Hold on, y'all gotta see my face. So back then it wasn't called miracles because we had magicians, and I feel like miracle and magician is almost the same amount of letters, just off the top. But a miracle is only a miracle because you are ignorant to the fact and or to the processes of what's going on. Hence why they demonize the word magic and magician now, and witch and wizard, or anything that has to do with earthly and natural science and natural processes. If Jesus was a magician, if Jesus was able to be in a particular environment and to augment that reality, yeah, they're going to want to get rid of that because he's self empowered. He's a God. You know what I'm saying? They don't want no GODs. Even before him, we got John the Baptist, we got Paul, we got all these niggas who was great, and they off them too. How you worshiping the same nigga you kill? So that's why it's like, even real Christians or people who are more into the empowerment aspect of religion be like, yeah, Jesus wants us to better ourselves, not just a cracker to worship, even though Jesus himself is a op. It's just, what I'm saying? Got to preface with that. It's just the silliness of worshiping somebody that you killed is crazy and like selling it. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, we got 8 minutes left now. But till they niggas didn't see me roll up down that shit.
And that he had a mind to do as much and more than they did. That Christ showed an unwillingness to die and shunned death all he could. That there is no punishment of sin, and that souls created by the operation of nature pass from one animal to another, and that as the brute animals are born of corruption, so also are men when after dissolution they come to be born again. Perfidious as they are, the above words plainly indicate the belief of Bruno in the Pythagorean metempsychosis, which, misunderstood as it is, it still shows a belief in the survival of man in one shape or another. Further, the accuser says, he has shown indications of wishing to make himself the author of a new sect, under the name of a new philosophy. He has said that the Virgin could not have brought forth, and that our Catholic faith is all full of blasphemies against the majesty of God, that the monks ought to be deprived of the right of disputation and their revenues, because they pollute the world, that they are all asses, and that our opinions are doctrines of asses, that we have no proof that our faith has merit with God, and that not to do to others what we would not have done to ourselves suffices for a good life, and that he laughs at all other sins, and wonders how God can endure so many heresies in Catholics. He says that he means to apply himself to the art of divination, and make all the world run after him, that St. Thomas and all the doctors knew nothing to compare with him, and that he could ask questions of all the first theologians of the world that they could not answer. To this, the accused philosopher answered the following profession of faith, which is that of every disciple of the ancient masters. I hold in brief to an infinite universe, that is, an effect of infinite divine power, because I esteemed it a thing unworthy of divine goodness and power, that being able to produce besides this world another and infinite others, it should produce a finite world. Thus, I have declared that there are infinite particular worlds similar to this of the earth, which, with Pythagoras, I understand to be a star similar in nature with the moon, the other planets, and the stars, which are infinite, and that all those bodies are worlds and without number, which thus constitute the infinite universality in an infinite space. And this is called the infinite universe, in which are innumerable worlds, so that there is a double kind of infinite greatness in the universe, and of a multitude of worlds. Indirectly, this may be understood to be repugnant to the truth according to the true faith. Moreover, I place this universe as a universal providence, by virtue of which everything lives, vegetates, and moves, and stands in its perfection, and I understand it in two ways. One, in the mode in which the whole soul is present in the whole and every part of the body, and this I call nature, the shadow and footprint of divinity. The other, the ineffable mode in which God, by essence, presence, and power, is in all and above all, not as part, not as soul, but in mode inexplicable. Moreover, I understand that all the attributes in divinity to be one and the same thing. Together with the theologians and great philosophers, I apprehend three attributes: power, wisdom, and goodness, or rather, mind, intellect, love, with which things have first being, through the mind, next ordered and distinct being, through the intellect, and third concord and symmetry, through love. Thus I understand being in all and over all, as there is nothing without participation in being, and there is no being without essence, just as nothing is beautiful without beauty being present. Thus nothing can be free from the divine presence, and thus by way of reason, and not by way of substantial truth, I do understand distinction in divinity. Assuming then the world caused and produced, I understand that according to all its being, it is dependent upon the first cause, so that it did not reject the name of creation, which I understand that Aristotle has also expressed, saying, God is that upon whom the world and all nature depends. So that according to the explanation of St. Thomas, whether it be eternal or in time, it is, according to all its being, dependent on the first cause, and nothing in it is independent. Next, in regard to what belongs to the true faith, not speaking philosophically, to come to individuality about the divine persons, the wisdom and the sun of the mind, called by philosophers intellect, and by theologians the word, which ought to be believed to have taken on human flesh. But I, abiding in the phrases of philosophy, have not understood it, but have doubted and held it with inconstant faith. Not that I remember to have shown marks of it in writing nor in speech, except indirectly from other things. Something of it may be gathered as by way of ingenuity and profession in regard to what may be proved by reason and concluded from natural light. Thus, in regard to the Holy Spirit in the third person, I have not been able to comprehend as ought to be believed, but according to the Pythagorean manner, in conformity to the manner shown by Solomon. I have understood it as the soul of the universe, or joined to the universe according to the saying of the wisdom of Solomon. The Spirit of God filled all the earth and that which contains all things, all which conforms equally to the Pythagorean doctrine explained by Virgil in the text of the Aeneid. And the lines following. From this Spirit, then, which is called the life of the universe, I understand, in my philosophy proceeds the soul to everything which has life and soul, which moreover I understand to be immortal, as also to bodies, which as to their substance are all immortal, there being no other death than division and congregation, which doctrine seems expressed in Ecclesiastes, where it is said that there is nothing new under the sun. That which is that which was. Furthermore, Bruno confesses his inability to comprehend the doctrine of three persons in the Godhead, and his doubts of the incarnation of God in Jesus, but firmly pronounces his belief in the miracles of Christ. How could he, being a Pythagorean philosopher, discredit them? If under the merciless constraint of the Inquisition, he, like Galileo, subsequently recanted and threw himself upon the clemency of his ecclesiastical persecutors. We must remember that he spoke like a man standing between the rack and the faggot, and human nature cannot always be heroic when the corporeal frame is debilitated by torture and imprisonment. But for the opportune appearance of Bertie's authoritative work, we would have continued to revere Bruno as a martyr, whose bust was deservedly set high in the pantheon of exact science, crowned with laurel by the hand of Draper. But now we see that their hero of the hour is neither atheist, materialist, nor positivist, but simply a Pythagorean who taught the philosophy of Upper Asia, and claimed to possess the powers of the magicians, so despised by Draper's own school. Nothing more amusing than this contretemps has happened since the supposed statue of St. Peter was discovered by irreverent archaeologists to be nothing else than the Jupiter of the Capitol, and Buddha's identity with the Catholic St. Josaphat was satisfactorily proven. Thus, search where we may through the archives of history, we find that there is no fragment of modern philosophy, whether Newtonian, Cartesian, Huxleyan, or any other, but has been dug from the Oriental mines. Even positivism and nihilism find their prototype in the exoteric portion of Kapila's philosophy, as is well remarked by Max Muller. It was the inspiration of the Hindu sages that penetrated the mysteries of prajna paramita, perfect wisdom, their hands that rocked the cradle of the first ancestor of that feeble but noisy child that we have christened modern science.
All right, gods and goddesses, that has been chapter 3 of Isis Unveiled. Thank y'all for listening. We will be back with chapter 4 soon. Let me guys know what you learning. Like, comment, subscribe. Peace.